So now we kick off part 2, and we have a panel of distinguished speakers in front of us to discuss the power to transform. Will the Catholic Church survive the 21st century? Wow. Professor Tina Beattie, I'll let you introduce the participants and take it away.
Is that better? Yes, good. Welcome to this panel discussion. This is very much a time of dialogue when we hope that as you listen to our speakers, you will also ask questions of the panel. Please tweet your questions to @VOFWomen, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible after our speakers have made some introductory discussions and comments. Pope Francis says this about dialogue in Amoris Laetitia. Men and women, young people and adults, communicate differently. We need to develop certain attitudes that express love and encourage authentic dialogue. Instead of offering an opinion or advice, we need to be sure that we've heard everything the other person has to say. Never downplay what they say or think, even if you need to express your own point of view. Keep an open mind. Don't get bogged down in your own limited ideas and opinions, but be prepared to change or expand them. So I feel really privileged to be chairing this opportunity for dialogue, when of course we're not in dialogue only with one another, but with our brothers in the Vatican. And we're delighted to know that even although they can't be with us today, they're certainly watching, and perhaps watching is the first road on the step to listening. So may I welcome our panelists, and you have full biographical notes in your programs, so I'll introduce them briefly. Former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, our keynote speaker, needs no introduction. She's already scintillated us with her visions of the church. And the theme of Mary's presidency was building bridges, and I think that's very much what we're trying to do here today, is to build bridges. We also have with us Luke Hansen, a Jesuit priest who's had much experience in the past working with people with mental illness, with people in Guantanamo Bay, with young people, with people really on the margins of society, which constituted part of his vocation to the priesthood. And Luke is now studying at the Gregorian University here in Rome, so welcome, Luke. Really delighted to have you with us. Also on our panel, it's a bit awkward having a low table and nowhere to put our notes, but there we go. Also, we have Elise Orbananos Hernando, and Elise is a regional programs representative for Jesuit Relief Service in the Great Lakes region of Africa. She brings with her a great deal of insight and experience into the struggles of African women in particular, and those who face the double jeopardy of gender and poverty. So welcome, Elise, to the panel. We also have Nicole Sotelo from the USA. Welcome, Nicole. Nicole is a journalist who served as a Young Voices columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, and her writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times. So, Nicole, we very much welcome you to the panel as well, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. And last but not least, Alina Oehler, who is also a writer, a German theologian and journalist. She currently freelances for various different newspapers and also has a weekly column in Die Zeit in Germany. So it's wonderful to have such a range of gifts and talents, and I'm sure that people will enjoy hearing what you have to contribute to our discussions. So I'm going to begin with a question for each speaker, which allows them to sort of position themselves, and then we'll follow that up with a discussion. So, Mary, the question we're addressing in this panel: will the church survive the 21st century? Until very recently, Ireland was regarded as a Catholic country, but today it seems that the church there has lost much of its influence. So based on your experiences of church and society in Ireland, what do you think the main issues are and what transformations might be needed for the church to regain trust and credibility, not just in order to survive, but to flourish in the 21st century? And of course, I'm asking that question particularly about women in the church.
Thank you very much indeed for the question. It's a question many of us are posing. Bishops are posing it. We will have a conference in May which asks the question, poses the question whether the church in Ireland has even 5 more years left. So there is a sense in Ireland, bearing in mind we are a Christian country, 1,500 years since the time of Patrick. We have been an overwhelmingly Catholic country since the Reformation. My own background, I'm born and raised a Catholic in Belfast, one of the eldest of 9 children. Because we were Catholics, we lost our home. My parents lost their business. My father lost his sanity. My brother was almost murdered. On the morning that we were married, 2 of our wedding guests, Catholics, were murdered in sectarian attacks. We lived in the area of Belfast with the highest density of sectarian murders, bar none. So that's my hinterland. And out of that hinterland, I had to ask myself, what values did I want to bring to my lived life? And we decided, Martin and I, my husband and I, that our values were the values of the gospel that we learned through the Catholic Church. This is what we were taught by our parents, by our teachers, that the belief that the wonderful commandment to love one another, no matter what, was actually capable of transforming and healing even the worst hurts, even the greatest hurts, the murders, the killings, the bombings, the intercommunal conflict. And that's what we set. That's where the theme of building bridges came from when I became president. So I believe that gospel. And I think that many, many people in Ireland still hope and believe in that gospel of love and believe in its power. And we've seen it in many ways. We've seen it in individual ways. But one of the things that we have never seen, really, because our church has grown, it became an empire. We're only now seeing the dismantling, the final dismantling of that patriarchal, misogynistic empire. So we've actually never seen our church fully flourish in the way that I think Christ intended. So we're now at a moment when the most educated generation in the history of Ireland is demanding that that's the church they want. And if it's not the church that is available, well, they'll walk away. And they will create other structures. They will be in other places. They will not be people who are faithless, but they will be people who maybe have simply lost faith in the capacity of institutions to drive something as wonderful as the power of love. Because the gravitational pull of patriarchy, empire, misogyny and of homophobia has drained, in many ways, drained respect, not just for the church, but I think the danger is that it would drain it for the gospel itself. And that's what keeps me in the church, really. The very idea that they would reduce Christ and the commandment to love to something so tiny and small, when it is something so extravagant and wonderful and healing. And we've seen what it can do in our lives. You know, over the 14 years I was president, people who, over their dead bodies, would have come to our home, little by little by little came, and the bridges were built. And so I've seen it work. I've seen what it can do. But will the church survive? I think the hierarchical church will not survive. The clericalized church will not survive. And that will be good. But just how long it might take, or whether I'll be around to see it, or whether my children will be still Catholics and my grandchildren, that I don't know. But frankly, I did my best. And the people who let me down in the job that I was given, the vocation as a Catholic mother and a Catholic woman, the people who let me down are not very far from here.
Thank you, Mary. Luke, your presence here today suggests that when the clericalism collapses, we will still have a few good men among us to act as... You're a rare breed in the church today, a young priest with a deep commitment to supporting the role of women in the church, as indeed is evidenced by your being here with us today. And your generation of priests is pivotal in helping us to make the kind of changes and face the issues we're addressing. But of course, we know that priests come from many different cultures and contexts, with many different cultural perspectives that they bring to the church. So given all the challenges that you face, I wonder if you can share what the most formative experiences have been in shaping your formation as a priest and your perspective, and how is your conviction fed regarding the involvement of women in the church in the 21st century?
Thank you, Tina. When I think about the most formative experiences I've had as I've gone through Jesuit formation and now as a priest, now I have to add today to that list of experiences. Because it's experiences like this, hearing the voices of women, hearing diverse stories, and women who are willing to ask critical questions and to really have the courage and the openness to listen to those questions and to take them seriously, to let them touch my heart, for them to shape my action then as a minister and as a priest in the church. One of the great gifts of my Jesuit formation has been a strong presence of women basically at every stage of formation, whether they've been professors of ethics, sacraments, even homiletics. The person who has taught me the most about Ignatian discernment is a Dominican sister who was my spiritual director for 3 years. I've been preparing for ministry with women, studying with women, working with women. I'm going to talk briefly about my experience as a deacon at a women's prison, but I always went to the prison with 1 or 2 of the female students at my School of Theology. So I got to see their ministry to these women up close. I got to hear their stories, their frustrations, their hopes for the church. So I'd like to talk about a couple privileged places where I've listened to some of these stories. And one of them is that women's prison, which is near San Francisco, California. I co-taught a course on forgiveness with one of my female classmates at the Jesuit School of Theology. And in this course, every week, we heard women, many from the United States, some immigrants from different parts of the world, share stories of sexual violence against them. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 women in the classroom. It was basically every woman in the classroom. And we heard about their struggle to forgive themselves, to forgive the perpetrators of this violence, the inability to forgive because the pain is so deep. And forgiveness can sometimes feel like permission or that what happened was okay, and it never is. Now, as a priest, I have an opportunity to preach, and sometimes I've preached on the topic of sexual violence, and I've used the word rape. And the few times I've done this, every time, women have come up to me and said, this is a reality in their life, in the lives of so many women in the pews each week, but it's something they've never heard preached from the pulpit. Which raises the question, how many issues that affect women's lives day in and day out, every Sunday, are not being addressed? Because in many cases, priestly formation mainly happens in a man's world. So I'm really grateful for the many ways that women have been a part of my formation and the way that friendships with women have really formed me. You know, friends who have been willing to challenge me, have asked critical questions, they've asked me to listen, to be attentive, to look around me, to notice the fact that I, as a man in the church, can pursue my dreams, pursue my sense for how God is calling me. But they can't. And what I've learned from listening to these women is that it's not a desire to hold power over another person, but it's a desire to be empowered and to use the gifts that the Holy Spirit has given them for service in the church. And I've heard too many stories of those gifts not being recognized or being excluded implicitly, explicitly. So why am I here? I think fundamentally because I want to see every person's gift being valued and being embraced and being empowered in the church that we live in. We need that. And I'm moved and inspired by the voices we've already heard at this event, which represent in so many ways the dreams that I have for the church, to see more partnerships between men and women, both in formation, in ministry, and in leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Elise, and your work with Jesuit Refugee Service takes you to the front line of the struggle for justice among some of the world's poorest and most marginalised people. And I'm interested because I know that you have an interest in power and how we understand it. So with regard to your understanding of power, how might women exercise power beneficially in the church today for a transformed church that, again, my question to Mary is the same to you, not only survives, but flourishes into the 21st century? And I know your work particularly comes from an African context in asking that question. Where do you think we women need to focus our energies in the church today for that to happen? And particularly with regard to that double jeopardy of poverty and gender that you work in the midst of?
Well, thank you very much for that question. So the first thing I want to say is, as you told, I'm very interested in power, but normally we are focused in power as a negative thing because, well, in those contexts we are used to talk about power as a vehicle of oppression, and it also is a tool of this patriarchal system the church seems inclined to. So that in one side, and the other side, and the power I want to talk about is power as an opportunity, as a tool for social change, for social justice, and for gender justice. I think we women already have that power, and it's obvious. We are like the majority of the parishioners, we are the majority of the working class all around the world, but the point is that power is not always visible. We have to make it visible. We have to come to the front line. For example, today in my country, many of my friends, even family members, they are supporting a feminist strike just to show how powerful we are and the amazing things we are doing as ordinary things, but that in fact are extraordinary. So can you imagine just for a while if we all women around the world just stopped for one day? It's not even societies, I mean, church as well would collapse. So we have that power. The problem is when it comes to the decision-making level, then both in church and in society, women are set aside. And that's a problem because, okay, women have different necessities, so they need different answers. And since we are making decisions, being men, the official discourse is necessarily incomplete. It's incomplete because there's just one part being missing. And it's also a huge problem from my point of view because then we are using that negative power. Women being constantly setting apart, it's a kind of violence. It's a structural violence. And it's the perpetuation of women as second-class citizens. And that's also perpetuating the patterns of an unequal society. And that's also legitimizing another kind of violence that could be domestic violence or sexual and gender-based violence. That's perpetuating, in the end, the feminization of poverty, because we are second-class citizens. So just trying to answer to the question where to focus our energies. I think we have to not just make our voice heard, but also listened. We are talking, we are always talking, but I think really time has come to act. Just because, well, being here in this aula maybe it's even stronger, but San Ignacio de Loyola said that love is shown more in deeds than in words.
Thank you. I think Ignatius also said something along the lines of preach Jesus constantly and use words if you must. I'm sure some Jesuits here can correct me. Thank you very much. And we may come back to some of those questions of power. I know there's an American theorist, Jean Beth Geilstein, who wrote very eloquently on the two kinds of power that have been used in history. She said, it's really wrong to say women have been powerless, but there's potestas, which is the institutionalized, structured power of the law and of hierarchies and institutions. And there's potentia, which is the charismatic power that women often wield when we must use charm, and I guess we must use feminine genius and our mystery and all that to get what we want. And her argument is, you know, both kinds of power can be used for good or for ill, and we really need to find a way, even as women gain access to potestas, to retain within our world that potentia which is relational and intuitive and charismatic. So thank you for that. Thank you. So, Nicole, as a Catholic journalist and writer, you've a particular influence as well in the effects of power and abuse. And I'm very interested that you've spoken of women silencing themselves in order to keep safe in the context of male domination. It's a very powerful thing to think about. And I'm sure those are questions that resonate with some of what Luke has said, and well, in fact, what all three of you have said so far about finding our voices and speaking. So what kind of empowerment do you think women need in order to break out of that self-imposed silence? And how might women's voices challenge existing oppressive power structures in the Church of the 21st century?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to start with a story to respond to that. Throughout my life, I have been witness to the circumstances of abuse. And in the context of the Catholic Church, one of those moments took place when I was 12 years old. That year, George Bredeman, a priest and who had served at our church and school, was rearrested while trying to flee the country while on probation for having sexually abused children. And what I remember about that time as a young girl were the women who would gather the mothers outside of our school to pick the children up. And they were whispering about it. I knew it was a serious issue. I didn't understand all the details, but what I remember is that the mothers handled it by whispering. No teachers spoke to us about it, and the priest never mentioned it on Sunday. Silence. And I mention this story because I think that's often what happens in our church today. Many Catholics, in the face of abuse or oppression or inequality, we keep silent. And in the United States, there's this wonderful psychologist, Carol Gilligan, who's done extensive research on at what ages both women and men begin to silence themselves so as to fit in to the patriarchal paradigm. And for young women, that begins at the age of 10, 11, and 12, the same age I was during this situation. And what happens is that these young women, like myself, we look to the older women to see how are we to be women. And we see our older women silencing themselves on issues of importance. And women who have much of our power only through relationship fear speaking out and ruining our relationships and losing the little bit of power we have. And so many women choose to keep silent. But the good news is that in the United States and in many countries around the world, there are church justice movements. And part of their goodness in the church is that they are encouraging women and men to speak up, to tell their story. And in doing so, they give other people courage who may have felt that they were the only ones. And together, we work together for change. And most importantly, I think, is that young girls in our Catholic Church today are able to see new models of what it's like to be a Catholic woman. They're no longer forced to make a decision between staying in the church and being silent or leaving. Instead, they're able to see that they can stay in the church and be who they are and speak their truth and work together for a more loving, a more just church, as has been modeled by Jesus himself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's certainly not much whispering going on here today. I'm sure we have many such role models among all the amazing women who have spoken here today. Alina, I mentioned building bridges in the context of Mary, but in a way, you're also a bridge builder. You're a young woman theologian and journalist who still speaks critically of the church as a men's club. But you've also described yourself as a liberal who became a conservative. Now, women of my generation are often told we're disgruntled middle-aged feminists and that young women are very happy with the church as it is. And I wonder what your experience is as a young Catholic woman who must surely have seen many of your friends leave the church. So how do you understand the liberal-conservative divide in that context? And of course, these words are never adequate, but you know what I mean. And what do you think is the most effective way for young people, young women like yourself, to work for change in the church?
Yeah, well, thank you, Tina. I first want to thank Voices of Faith for being a part of this great panel and this great event. I'm very happy to be here in Rome and to discuss this important issue with you. Thank you for the great question. You seemed right. I have seen many of my friends leave the church. Well, I grew up in a very Catholic region in the south of Germany, and in my childhood it was completely normal to be Catholic. But when I'm coming back home on Sundays in my village and I go to church, I can't find anyone at my age. Only old people are there, because the younger ones, my generation, they already left. And when I'm meeting them for coffee and we talk about what I'm doing, they can't understand that I studied theology. They ask me, how can you still be loyal to this club? You can't be anything, you can't achieve anything big as a female theologian. So they don't understand me, they question me all the time. And I think that's an important point I want to make. Most of the young people in Germany, they imagine the church like she appears on the media as a men's club. You already mentioned that. Now you could say, but we already have women in leadership positions in German dioceses. And of course that's true, but do you know them? Do you see them? Well, the insiders do, yes, but the public does not. And looking back in the history of the church, we can find so many great examples when the intellectual potential of women had been important and visible. For instance, I think of St. Catherine of Siena, who was a consultant to the Pope, or Hildegard of Bingen, or Edith Stein, just to name three. But all those women, they died a long time ago. And I ask you, can you imagine today a woman standing next to the Pope, being his consultant, for example, like Catherine of Siena is pictured in many paintings? Can you imagine that? I think it's not easy. And I brought a picture with me to demonstrate that a bit further. Maybe they can put it on the screen. But I can, thanks. Okay, it's an old picture I found by accident in a priest's house. And as you can see, it shows a bishop and an abbess during the liturgy in Austria. And both are having a crozier. And I was so excited when I saw this the first time, because I had never seen a woman and next to a bishop in such a high position in the liturgy. And I was asking, what is this? Can you explain it to me? And I posted it on Facebook, and an old professor of mine wrote a comment, and he's a professor of church history, and he wrote, that's nothing unusual, we know, we had that, and so on and so on. And my secular friends, they reacted, and they wrote, no, it's not usual, I've never seen something like this. What is this woman? What is it about? So I think as long as a picture like this seems to be unreal to us, or to my generation, how can we expect young and ambitious women to picture themselves in the church if they only picture bishops and popes and priests when it comes to leadership? And of course, it's like Mary McAleese said in her keynote speech, it's not only about visibility, it's also about having a voice. Yeah, so that's the first point I want to make. And the second is that, how you very truly said, Tina, there are nevertheless young women in the church who are happy. And I would consider myself a happy Catholic woman, because as you introduced me, I started to study theology as a liberal who wanted to change the church, like any political system can be changed. But then I made some very moving spiritual experiences during the liturgy and concerning the sacrament of the Eucharist. And when I studied here in Rome, I got to a deeper understanding of my faith. And it was a very rich time for me spiritually. And from that on, I wrote some articles for German newspapers in which I took, as you can say, conservative positions. But to be honest, I don't like the liberal-conservative divide. Especially in Germany, we Catholics are becoming a smaller and smaller group. And I don't know what will be in 20 or 30 years. I mean, the German church is rich. There will be buildings, there will be, but will there be people? So I think we need to focus on what we have in common, and we have to find a way to bring the joy of the gospel to the people and make this visible. And of course, women need to have leadership positions in that. And referring to the last part of your question very briefly, I think one effective way for young women like me to work for change in the church in everyday life could be, or should be, that we are confident enough to make our voice heard at every occasion possible. Because women are still not taken serious in parishes and in the hierarchy. And I made this experience myself so many times. I'm married, and every time I'm with my husband in some church surroundings and I'm being introduced, I'm not of great interest because I'm the wife, of course. And then when I get to know, oh, she studied theology and she's a journalist, I suddenly became interesting. So I think we desperately need a change in mentality here. And we women can work on that too by challenging the clerics. And I think we should do that, and every woman should do this. But of course, it's not enough. It's just part of a bigger problem. But I think before you can change the system, you need to change the mentality, because you have to get the man on your side. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your great answers. And just to clarify, I think all of the women who are speaking here today are happy in the church, or we wouldn't be here. So I said we're told there are young women who are happy in the church as it is. So stop trying to change it, because the young women like it as it is. So clearly we all are happy women in the church, but we want to change the church.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not a native English speaker, so.
But that, your point that both of you have made about it's not enough to make women visible, women also have to be heard. And one of the things that interests me about different things you've all said really is this idea of hearing women's voices, women not speaking in whispers, telling stories. Mary started with a very personal story of what motivated you. And I think it's a great shift, actually, even in Pope Francis's theology. He's a narrative theologian. He recognizes that meaning comes not through abstract doctrinal arguments, but through gestures and stories that root the gospel in people's lived realities. And I think that's a lot of what we're hearing today. But what interests me is that in order for that to happen, we need safe spaces in which we can speak and be heard and don't have to speak in whispers, and don't teach our daughters, and in my case, granddaughters, that the best way to survive in your relationships and your life is to speak in whispers or not say anything. We have such a safe space here, with many thanks to the Jesuits for creating it. But we still know that while the church should be for all of us that safe space, actually, I suspect for most modern women who remain in the church, it's the space where we most often have to censor ourselves if we don't want to lose those relationships and become very uncomfortable in the context we're trying to work in. And with that in mind, I kind of want to come to you, Elise, again, because your experience of African women, I mean, I know from having lived there for many years, African cultures are great storytelling cultures. Women have amazing stories to tell. But in my experience, the stories you hear when you get a group of African women on their own without any men in the room are often very different from the stories that they'll tell the men, because the men won't listen to certain stories. And I'd really like to ask you more about that, how that works among African women that you work among, making their voices heard and telling the whole story, not just the bits that will be approved of.
What a question. Well, I think I'm lucky enough to work for the Jesuit Refugee Service. And one of the core groups we work with are obviously women, victims of sexual and gender-based violence. And one of the most important things I think we try to do is to accompany them. That means being with and listen to them. So our mission is to accompany, to serve, and to advocate for them. We really try to do so by being with them and by pushing them to raise their voices. So what we try to do is just, okay, that happened to you, but now you have a new life, you have a new opportunity. So speak out. And not just about what happened, but about your dreams. What do you want to do? What do you want to become from now on? It's a pity because, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I see in African church is not what I would love to see. As I was saying before, there's half of the story which is missing. And well, Joanna before, she was saying that, okay, those women are already in that church. But Joanita was also saying that they don't feel safe in that church. I really think we have to change that as a church. Maybe it should be, as you said, a safe space, an open space, because they are going Sunday after Sunday to Mass, but they don't share their experiences, their feelings, because first of all, they don't feel safe, they are afraid of speaking out. Second of all, because they don't feel supported, and because they know, well, I don't want to make it general, but at least in the countries where I work, bishops are normally trying to keep women silent. And that's, I mean, that's very cruel. Because as I was saying before, they are the base and the basis of society. And even more those women who really have been victims of the worst experiences you can imagine, they need to speak up. They need to be strong enough as to show the power they have inside, to transmit those stories to their children, to new generations. And I really think it's a pity and it's an opportunity we're just wasting if we don't open the doors in the church for them. That should be the safest space for them, and it's not. So all that I can say is that let's open the doors in our ears as church members.
Thank you. And sort of taking up on that, because Mary, as you were speaking initially, I had this wonderful image of how Martin and you had created a safe space, in a space riven with bitterness and violence and conflict, and somehow in the presence you created, people began to feel safe to come and build those bridges and talk across the abyss and to forge a future out of that kind of. And so I kind of wonder, if we talk about the church, what would it take for people to feel that way about the church? In Ireland, for example, where so many people feel it's the last place they will go with their stories of vulnerability and hurt and exclusion. We know even with the LGBTQI issue in terms of the forthcoming World Meeting on the Family, it's kind of every effort made to push people still outside the frame. What must the church do to become a safe space, like your home was during the Troubles, for people from both sides to listen and make peace?
I can just give a couple of examples of things that I think work and would help. They come from my own direct experience. I'm the oldest member of the panel. I have a bus pass to prove it. So,
so do I.
And do you have a free bus pass, though? Anyway, look, Martin and I grew up in a conflict-ridden society that descended into civil war between Catholics and Protestants. Christians, God help us. We both lived in Protestant neighbourhoods as Catholics, and most of my friends growing up were Protestants. And one of the things I learned is how easy it is to live right next door to people, cheek by jowl, in complete ignorance of each other. And what is worse, to think you know each other just because you live beside each other. Let me take that to the church. There are people, we have a very stratified church, very, very caste-ridden, if you like. And at each level or section, we hear talk among ourselves. The next level up, talk among themselves. At the very top, they definitely just talk among themselves. And the danger is, because we belong to the one church, and very often use similar language drawing from the Gospels, that we think we understand how each other thinks. But we haven't created the conduits to each other, whether the talking, the dialogue, the listening conduits, and those conduits are utterly essential. That's what we did in our house. We created actual conduits, not just days for photo opportunities, you know, with nice pet Protestants or nice pet Catholics, but photo days when photographs didn't matter, but talking to each other did. When I started working at Queen's University in Belfast in the 1980s, 2 reports landed on the desk of the Vice-Chancellor. One said we didn't employ enough Catholics. One said we didn't employ enough women. Very badly. So how were we going to change that? And it wasn't just enough to dialogue, that was important, but you also had to have structure and you had to have training. So we developed a training program for all our staff to try and introduce each of us, including me, to the baggage that we carry with us that doesn't allow us to stand in the shoes of the other, that dares to tell us that we actually think we know the other, but we don't. So to become aware of the otherness of the other, we created a huge, big training program. And what's remarkable to me is how very quickly a university that was essentially being accused of bigotry against Catholics went from having a very low representation to having a very presentable and decent representation of Catholics. We weren't so successful with women. What did that tell me? It told me that the sectarian impulses were much easier to change, because they only went back to the Reformation. The ones, seriously, I'm being serious here, the embedded ones against women, they went back right down to Patria Potestas, Roman law, Judaic law, all the way down through church law, much more deeply embedded. So if I was to be asked what we need in our church at the moment, we need structure, not just dialogue in the strata, but dialogue up through the strata, and we need structure. And the structure that we need, for example, I would take every bishop No, I wouldn't actually take them as such. But no, definitely not. But I would insist that every single bishop and every single prelate in leadership positions would undergo equal opportunities training. I don't know any who have. And people can have sensitivity to women in the church, but unless you've done the training, the intensity and probity that you have, and the intensity and the profound understanding you have, really hasn't been deepened enough to be able to provoke change. And the final thing I would say is, we had a conflict in Ireland that lasted for centuries. We got a Good Friday Agreement in 1998, thank God, 20 years ago, that helped us to create a process for peace. It took a lot of effort to put that together. But that gave us a structure for the future through which we could dialogue with each other. Common values, common language, parity of esteem, shared governance. So not easy to put on paper, but a roadmap to a future of equality written in an international treaty. That is what our church now needs. That level of structure. Invite women, take our bishops away and give them equal opportunities training. Then say to them, now we need to talk about how we put structure on this and get our own navigational roadmap to future equality for all in the church. Actually, Bishop Farrell said it the other day. He said, it's a process. But as I said earlier, all process, like the peace process, you have to have the navigational tools. You have to have the structure. We absolutely do not have that currently in the church. Strategy and structure.
Thank you. And I actually want to come back to some of those points in a minute with my next question, actually. But I want to ask Alina, because if we're talking about this need to create spaces to hear the other, to hear one another, and, even if we drop the language of liberal conservative, we know that the church is fractured today between polarized positions. And it's very difficult, I think, probably for a young woman like you who sees good on both sides. How would you create a space to persuade those young women who say to you, you're crazy, why are you still doing this? To say, well, listen and let's talk to each other and understand each other and create a safe space for us all to be in the church, because as G.K. Chesterton said of the Catholic Church, here comes everybody. It's not like that today. How can we make it like that?
Well, it's difficult. I think we need to discuss this in the church, and I trust the Holy Spirit, if we really have a discussion on higher levels, that there will be a solution. And of course, I can think of some solutions, but it's hard for me to tell, because it's not so realistic, I think, that this will happen in the next 5 years, I'm afraid to say. But of course, we need to have women in visible positions in the front row to change the feeling of young women towards the society, so that they can know to whom they can turn to whom they can talk to. And one possibility maybe could be to think how you can empower lay people in general more in the church. It's also a question about laymen, by the way. And in earlier times, I like to look back into the tradition of the church. In earlier times, laymen could become cardinals, for example. So why shouldn't this be an option for women too? It would be a first row position, and it would be visible, and it would be in the Vatican. So why can't we talk about something like this, for example? But that's just my idea. As I said, I would trust a process in the Vatican, and I trust the Holy Spirit, and I want to have this discussion. Yeah, and so that's just one idea.
That's great, and that really does bring me on to the next question I want to ask. Women cardinals, why not? There's no real, I understand there's a tiny little bit in canon law that could be changed tomorrow, and we could have women cardinals the next day, because many of us are theologically educated enough. I say us, I don't want to be one. I can wear red shoes without being a cardinal, but why not? Okay. I want to come on to that, though, because it's following on what we're talking about. the impatience that so many people feel. I'm reminded, you say we trust the Holy Spirit. There's a priest stranded on a desert island and praying for a rescue, and a helicopter goes by and he says, no, don't worry. And then a ship goes by and he says, no, it's all right. Please, God, send someone to rescue me. And the Holy Spirit says, well, for God's sake, I've sent a helicopter and a ship. What are you waiting for? So we can't just wait for the Holy Spirit to rescue us. We have to look for where the Holy Spirit is sending along the means to do so, I think. And that brings me to the next question, that I often, when I begin to feel, am I saying too much too loudly, go back to Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he says this, and I've edited out some of the language, but I think we can share some of the sentiment. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. For years now, I have heard the word wait. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see that justice too long delayed is justice denied. That's his response to the Alabama clergyman who, in a unique and rare moment of interfaith and ecumenical dialogue in the early 1960s, managed to join ranks, Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, a rabbi. The only person missing was a Muslim, because in those days, perhaps, Islam wasn't quite the presence it is today in our societies. If it had been now, there might have been an imam there as well. But when men of God have a common enemy, my God, do they get together? And I think today often that common enemy is women. There's nothing like forging interfaith and ecumenical unity to gang up against women. But anyway, my question would be, we've waited long enough. Women want some tangible, substantial sign that it's worth hanging on in there and struggling, because look, change is happening. We can point to it, we can see it. So, Nicole, let me ask you, if you could see one thing that would be possible now to say that to women, look, I can point to that change that gives you hope that you are winning this struggle, stay in and struggle with us. What would you like to see?
Well, I think on the long run, I would agree with what's been shared about needing to work for a comprehensive plan to integrate women into decision-making roles, not just fitting them into current clerical molds, but really, as a church, reimagining what does healthy and holy and gospel-rooted leadership look like to meet today's needs. But I think one thing that could happen very easily tomorrow would be to have Catholic pastoral councils set up in every diocese, where in areas where perhaps there's less representation now in diocesan leadership, while we work towards that comprehensive plan. But in the meantime, we could have Catholic pastoral councils that could help the diocesan leaders hear from the underrepresented areas of our church, both on women's issues, but also on issues of race and class and LGBT issues. It's something very simple that wouldn't take much in terms of resources and could happen tomorrow. And I think that would be a wonderful step towards a future that would really speak to our church today.
Thank you, thank you. And we have some really good questions from audiences as well, but before I turn to those, I'm going to briefly ask Luke, what one thing would you change so that we can point to something in the church and say, the change is real and it's happening?
I think, speaking from my cultural context in the United States, something that's raised hopes and excited people is the Papal Commission on Women Deacons. After that commission was announced in May 2016, I started receiving invitations to Catholic parishes to speak about the commission. The permanent diaconate is very popular in the United States. The United States has, I think, more than half of the permanent deacons in the world, who are often married men. And I found out by visiting these parishes that People didn't know a whole lot about the theology and the history of the diaconate. They weren't familiar with the tradition of women deacons in the church in different places and times, at different responsibilities. But the announcement of the commission was something that people were really excited by, and they wanted to learn more. So visiting these parishes was a great opportunity to hear people's hopes and dreams for the church. And I don't know what the status of that commission is today. It started a year ago, and we don't receive reports on their meetings. But I know that the commission continues to meet. And this is a very practical step in a very important part of the church's life. Deacons have many responsibilities, but one of them is within liturgy, to assist at the altar, to give homilies on Sundays. This is the contact for the vast majority of Catholics, is the Mass, gathering with the community on Sunday. So to see a visible presence of women in the Mass, serving as permanent deacons with a voice to reflect on the gospel, to proclaim the gospel, to interpret the scriptures, to break open the word, I think is revolutionary and really affects the Catholic imagination in seeing women in a very visible liturgical leadership role. So I have hope around the Women Deacons Commission, even though I don't know where it's going or when a decision will be made.
Thank you. So I'm going to just put these questions to you in general. I'd like to get through them, and I'm aware of time, so if you can keep your responses very focused and brief and speak to the question. The first question from Deborah. If you had one thing to ask Pope Francis on behalf of women, what would it be? Just one? Just one?
I only get one. I only get one. Publish the report on the diaconate. We know that it is either ready or close to ready, possibly even has been ready for some time. We don't really know. Why don't we know? Why weren't we told? Here's when the report is expected. Here's when it will be published. Let us have a forum like this, live fed, where it can be discussed. And then somebody like the Pope says, and here are the follow-up steps you can now expect. Here is the time scale. Here is the strategy. Here are the outcomes, not reports that die on the vine.
So, Pope Francis, please publish the findings of the Commission on the Diaconate in a public forum like this. We're sure the Jesuits would let you use the aula if you're not allowed to speak in the Vatican. Anyone else want to throw something in there quickly? We'll come back to Pope Francis in a minute. Thank you for that question, Deborah. Sister Leah, the question was asked if the church will survive, but the real question is, will women make sure that the Vatican II church survives? I'm aware most of our panelists are probably so young that they've never known anything but the Vatican II church, but you know what the question means, the church that was dreamed of in Vatican II, but yes, like Sleeping Beauty, is waiting in a tower for hopefully not another handsome prince of the church to wake her up, but princess next time. A princess. So how will women make sure that the Church of Vatican II survives? Alina, do you want to try that? Because, and I'll come to you then, because you're kind of trying to hold them both together.
Yeah, I mean, we should define what is meant by the Church of Vatican II. I think there are many possibilities to, what does it mean? But I want to make one point maybe, because I'm interested in the tradition of the Church, and I'm also interested in liturgy. And there is a big rise of the old rite. That's interesting. There are so many young people who are interested in this old Latin Mass thing, and I was in several cities in Germany, in France, in Italy, and it really is a big thing. And I'm interested in why are those people, or young people, interested in this old kind of liturgy, and they are, if you talk to them, they're telling you, well, the new rite, the Vatican II Mass, if you would say so, it's not what we want. It's too political. We want a holy atmosphere. We want to pray. We want the beauty of the church. Yeah. So I think there is this danger that comes from the Vatican II generation, if you can say, to see things very political and not so spiritual. But it's just my point of view. We can discuss this.
Yes.
And yeah. I think it's very interesting. You can just visit churches where these old masses from the Fraternity of St. Peter, for example, were said, and there are so many young people. It's just interesting. I have no conclusion yet, but I'm just researching it.
I mean, I've been reflecting on a little conversation you and I had an opportunity to have about that, and also the sort of regret that I think you expressed, that so often that old rite goes hand in hand with very misogynistic attitudes to
That's
the
right.
involvement and participation of women.
That's right.
So there's work to be done.
Definitely.
Yeah, thank
But
you.
it's a phenomena we have to look at,
Yes.
I think.
Thank you. Nicole, you were going to speak.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most important parts of Vatican II was the universal call to holiness. The fact that not just the clergy, but all God's people are called to participate in the church. I think we've seen this, heard this again recently from Pope Francis, who's called us again to be, all of us, to be missionary disciples. But I think part of that discipleship and missionary focus also needs to be turned inward. How can we all participate, not just outside the church doors, but inside the church doors? So I really believe that to keep that spirit of universal discipleship alive from Vatican II is up to every single one of us in this room, around the world. The call from God is to each of us to step into the people we've been called to be, and we're responsible for carrying forth not just Vatican II, but the gospel that was given to us by Christ.
Thank you. Voices of Women, please speak about spiritual abuse. This is from Felix. Isn't the denial of women in the priesthood a form of spiritual abuse? Who wants to go there? Sorry, you said that.
Yes.
Speak in a whisper.
From the gift of the friendships I've had and the women that I've listened to who have experienced a call to ordained ministry as deacons, as priests, it would certainly seem so. Because for them, that sense of call, which when I hear them describe their vocation story and I ask them about it, seems so familiar to my own story. You know, what attracts them to ordained ministry is what attracted me. A positive experience of the church, a priest that I admired when I was younger, priests in my life as a Catholic adult that I was drawn to, that I found inspiration in, that I saw making a difference in people's lives. This is the reality that draws these women to this ministry. And obviously, it puts them in a very complicated, confusing, painful situation to not have the opportunity to even explore that call. It's not an insistence on a right to ordination, which is not a right. It's a call that comes from the community and is confirmed by the community. I haven't thought of the language of spiritual abuse, but what I've seen is that it's really painful. It's both a joy, it's a joy of discovering how God wants you to be in the world. And I've been able to see some of these women preach and exercise ministry at the women's prison, some liturgical leadership, liturgies of the word, and you see the joy and the gifts that they have for it. But it's also so painful because not only is this basically unrealistic for them at this point to even try to imagine how this vocation could be fulfilled. But they don't feel free to even talk about it in a classroom, at a school of theology, or in other places. So it's a painful reality from what I've been gifted to hear. And I think a really important point of emphasis is that in the end, it's about the individual person and their dignity and their sense of vocation, but it's the right of the community to ministers as well. As so many parishes close and merge, and people value priesthood and want priests who are inspiring leaders in their communities, who are agents of healing. It's the right of the community to these ministers. So that becomes a painful, complicated reality for these women.
Thank you. And it goes back really to being able to tell our stories, doesn't it? I'm just editing a collection of writings by Catholic women, and I must say the section where they tell their stories of vocation to priesthood leave me in tears as I read them again and again and again, because there is that reality of vocation and frustration and denial of very great gifts. And in some of the stories I read, I think what wonderful priests these would be. So, hang on and pray on. All right, now this one, can we have quick responses to this? Pope Francis tweeted today, when I first saw this, I thought, oh, Pope Francis has tweeted a question. Well, let's pretend he did. So, let's pretend. He said today at 1:30 p.m. on his tweet, I thank all women who every day strive to build more humane and welcoming societies. Pope Francis, you're very welcome. And having read what you said on Dialogue, we would like to respond. Elise, how would you respond? As someone who works very hard to build more humane and welcoming societies.
I mean, thank you for that tweet, and thank you again for thank you again for open dialogue. But then again, talking. We need action. That's all I can say. Thank you for your words, but we need deeds.
Deeds, yes. We like the tweets, but please. Who else? Mary, do you want to give a quick response?
Oh, I think it's a rather nice tweet, so why don't you invite us in for the conversation?
Anyone else? Well, we'll keep working for a more humane and welcoming society, and we women know that you must put your own house in order before you start telling others how to run theirs. So we would have liked a humane welcome this week, wouldn't we?
Would have been nice. Might have been Christ-like. But maybe that's asking too much.
Yasmin asks, Voices of Faith women, how should parishioners continue where the words of Mary McAleese left off?
I left off? I left off?
She's not finished yet. So, parishioners, when we all go back, energized, we've had a vision, we've been inspired, we've spoken into the safe space, we've said what needs to happen next, we need to hear the results of the Commission on Deacons, we need to ask why women couldn't be cardinals, we need to ask why, now that the Commission's work is finished, women can't become permanent deacons, and we need to continue the conversation. How will we do it when we go back to our parishes? Any suggestions? Maybe that's a good question for everyone here just to think about, because actually it's the answers we take back with us and what we do tomorrow and the week after and the year after that will be the answer to that question. How much difference will today have made? So I want to finish now, and I want each of you just to answer in one short answer, one short answer. Why are you still a Catholic? Alina.
Yeah, as I already stated, I'm very happy to be Catholic, because I experienced the love and grace of God through that church and through its sacraments, and my faith in Jesus Christ, and reading the gospel, enjoying the beauty of churches, enjoying the liturgy. It's giving me so much power in my everyday life, and I couldn't imagine a life without it. So that's why I'm still happy to be Catholic.
Thank you. A happy Catholic. Luke, why are you a happy Catholic?
I mean, fundamentally, for me, especially when I'm speaking with friends who are not religious at all, the fundamental point is that God is real, Jesus is alive. My life has been transformed by his presence, especially during really challenging times in my life. I've been carried along by a sense of the mercy and love of Jesus and consolation. And this is a gift that I want to share with my life. It's why I became a priest. And it's, you know, in the context of everything else that we talk about, for me, that is what is most fundamental, is receiving that gift and sharing that gift.
Thank you. Nicole, why are you still a Catholic and a happy Catholic?
I would say because I truly believe in God. I believe in Jesus, who came to dwell among us and teach us to love. I believe in the Holy Spirit, who I believe continues to call us to seek God's kingdom, and not kingdom, but kingdom, K-I-N, as I was taught by Mujerista theologian Maria Isazi-Diaz. And I think today, particularly on International Women's Day, in part I stay Catholic because of the young women who will come after me. I continue to stay in and work for change because I don't want them to have to struggle as much as so many of us have, simply to be who God has called them to be in the church they love.
Thank you. Elise, why are you still a Catholic?
I guess it's just because I'm still in love. I feel loved by God. I'm in love of what I do every day. To me, to accompany, to serve, to advocate for refugees is definitely building kingdom. And I can do it because I'm a Catholic, so I'm a proud Catholic. And I guess I just love the church that made me the person I am today. And I just struggle to be loved in return.
Thank you. Mary, why are you still a Catholic?
My parents chose this faith for me. Like so many of us here, I'm a pedo-baptized cradle Catholic. I stay now because I choose. I choose to be one of 1.2 billion people stretched across 5 continents, part of an institution that has no equal on the planet in terms of its outreach to the poor, to the dispossessed, to the marginalized, part of an institution, the hands of God's work in the world. No NGO does what the Catholic Church does through ordinary people like those gathered here. They're the people who inspire me. It's their work that drives me on and gives me hope for the future. And I stay because I believe that if the power of the voices coming from those frontline troops can work its way up through this dreadfully stylized imperial hierarchy that is only an historic artifact, not of divine creation. But when that falls away, I think we can flood the world with the love of Christ. And that, I think, is what keeps me in the church.
Flood the world with the love of Christ. And I think Joanna said today, women are like water. So I think this event today has probably built up the floodwaters. And I said to somebody who asked me this morning, do you have hope? And I said, you know, it is like the incoming tide. She said, do you think this event will make a difference? You know, I live on a houseboat and I watch the tide come in every day. And there isn't a moment at which you can say it turned. But suddenly you know it has turned. And every drop of water that was part of that turning counts. So today I really do believe that we are the turning tide. And as Canute once learned, don't stand on the shore and say, go back, because we're going to keep coming in and coming in and coming in, and there's nothing can stop the incoming tide. So flood the world with love, and I think that's a nice note to end on. Thank you.